February 9th, 1944, 23,000 feet above Oschersleben, Germany. Captain Don Gentile rolls his P-51B Mustang into a shallow dive, tracking a Focke-Wulf 190 that's broken away from its formation after a failed attack on B-17 seconds below. The German pilot sees him coming and does exactly what his training demands. He pushes his throttle forward and extends away in a shallow climb, using the 190's superior roll rate and dive speed to create separation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Gentile doesn't chase directly. Instead, he adjusts his angle to cut inside the German's turn, matching altitude while closing the range. His airspeed indicator reads 320 miles per hour. The Focke-Wulf is perhaps 50 yards ahead. Too far. Gentile's hand rests on the trigger, but he doesn't fire, not yet. He's waiting for something specific, something that most fighter pilots in early 1943 didn't understand, but by early 1944 had become the defining tactical principle of American fighter doctrine. He's waiting for 400 yards. At 380 yards, Gentile squeezes the trigger. 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns erupt simultaneously. The convergence point, where all 6 guns' trajectories intersect, sits precisely at 400 yards ahead of his aircraft. For exactly 8 seconds of firing time, every round from all 6 guns passes through a space roughly 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall. The Focke-Wulf flies directly into this invisible box of destruction. The effect is catastrophic. 20mm cannon shells from German fighters might punch individual holes in American bombers, but 50 caliber rounds arriving in concentrated streams don't punch holes. They saw through airframes. The 190's right-wing root disintegrates. Hydraulic fluid sprays. The canopy shatters. Gentile releases the trigger after a 3-second burst and pulls up as the German fighter rolls inverted and begins its 4-mile plunge toward the frozen earth below. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This scene, or variations of it, played out thousands of times over Europe during 1944. American fighter pilots had discovered something that transformed them from marginally effective bomber escorts into the dominant air superiority force of World War II. They had learned to weaponize geometry. The 8-second window at 400 yards wasn't a suggestion or a guideline. It was a calculated killing zone based on ballistics, closing speeds, and the physical limitations of 50 caliber ammunition. And understanding why it worked requires going back to 1942, when American fighter pilots were doing almost everything wrong. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the Army Air Forces possessed fighter aircraft with impressive specifications on paper, but almost no institutional knowledge about how to actually fight with them. The P-40 Warhawk, America's primary fighter in early 1942, carried 6 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing. These weapons could fire roughly 800 rounds per minute per gun, creating a theoretical weight of fire that exceeded most German and Japanese fighters. The problem wasn't the guns. The problem was that American pilots had almost no idea where their bullets were actually going. Pre-war gunnery training focused on fixed targets, or very slow-moving towed sleeves. Students learned to center targets in their gun sights and fire, which worked fine against stationary ground targets or aircraft flying straight and level at predictable speeds. Combat over Europe and the Pacific revealed this training as dangerously inadequate. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, who would later become one of the top American aces with 27 confirmed kills, described his first combat engagement over France in June 1943 with painful honesty. He had spotted a Focke-Wulf 190 at his 11 o'clock position, roughly 200 yards out. Johnson turned hard into the German fighter, centered it in his gun sight, and opened fire. He burned through nearly 400 rounds in a 5-second burst. Every single bullet missed. The Focke-Wulf pilot apparently never even noticed Johnson's attack, continuing his dive toward a formation of B-17 seconds below. The statistical evidence from early 1943 painted an even grimmer picture. Analysis of gun camera footage from 8th Air Force fighter groups showed that American pilots were achieving hit rates of approximately 4% in fighter versus fighter engagements. 4% meant that for every 100 rounds fired, 96 struck nothing but empty air. Given that most fighter engagements lasted between 6 and 15 seconds, pilots were emptying their ammunition without inflicting meaningful damage on enemy aircraft. The mathematics of aerial combat were brutally unforgiving. A P-47 Thunderbolt carried roughly 400 rounds per gun across 8 50 caliber machine guns, giving the pilot about 3,200 rounds total. At maximum rate of fire, all 8 guns could empty completely in 24 seconds. At a 4% hit rate, that meant approximately 128 rounds would actually strike an enemy aircraft during a full ammunition expenditure. A FW-190 could absorb significant battle damage. Luftwaffe maintenance reports indicated that 190s routinely returned to base after taking 15 to 20 direct 50 caliber hits, assuming those hits didn't strike critical systems. The problem had multiple layers, but the most fundamental issue was convergence. Fighter aircraft mounted their guns in the wings, not the fuselage. This meant the guns were physically separated, typically by 6 to 8 feet on American fighters. When you fired, bullets from the left-wing guns traveled on one trajectory, while bullets from the right-wing guns traveled on a different trajectory. These trajectories were angled slightly inward, so they would cross at some predetermined distance ahead of the aircraft. That crossing point was the convergence zone. The question that American fighter groups spent most of 1943 arguing about was simple but critical. Where should that convergence point be? The answer that seemed obvious to pilots trained in peacetime doctrine was as close as possible. If your guns converged at 200 yards, then any enemy aircraft within 200 yards would be inside your effective range. Close-range convergence meant a larger margin for error. You could be slightly off target and still hit something. 8th Air Force fighter groups initially set convergence at 250 yards as standard doctrine in early 1943. This seemed logical because most aerial combat training emphasized getting close before firing. The German Luftwaffe used similar principles. Their pilots trained to close to within 150 yards before opening fire, putting them inside what they called the effective zone, where their 20mm cannons could inflict maximum damage. But American pilots quickly discovered that closing to 250 yards against experienced German pilots was almost impossible. Luftwaffe fighter tactics in 1943 were sophisticated and brutal. German pilots didn't dogfight with American escorts. They attacked bombers, and when American fighters intervened, German pilots used speed and altitude advantages to disengage. The FW-190 could outdive any American fighter in service during early 1943. The Messerschmitt 109 had superior climb rates above 20,000 feet. German pilots would make slashing attacks on bomber formations, then extend away using speed before American escorts could close to effective gun range. Major Gerald Johnson, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group flying P-47 Thunderbolts, compiled detailed after-action reports from his pilots during the summer of 1943. His analysis revealed a disturbing pattern. In engagements where American pilots closed to within 300 yards of German fighters, the Germans almost always saw them coming and maneuvered away before guns could be brought to bear. The few times American pilots achieved firing solutions at close range, their shooting was erratic. The stress of close combat, combined with high deflection angles, resulted in wild spraying rather than concentrated fire. Johnson's report concluded that the doctrine of close-range engagement was fundamentally flawed for bomber escort missions. American fighters needed to engage German attackers before they reached the bomber formations, which meant opening fire at ranges exceeding 400 yards. But at 400 yards, with guns converged at 250 yards, bullets were still spreading outward from their initial trajectories. The convergence zone hadn't formed yet. Pilots were essentially firing two separate groups of bullets that passed on either side of the target. The solution emerged not from official doctrine, but from maintenance crews experimenting with different convergence settings. Master Sergeant Raymond Tolliver, an armourer with the 4th Fighter Group at Debden, started adjusting gun convergence based on pilot feedback in July 1943. Lieutenant Dwayne Beeson complained that his guns seemed effective at longer ranges but useless up close. Tolliver suspected Beeson's guns were converged too far out, perhaps at 500 yards. He adjusted the convergence to 350 yards and sent Beeson back up. Beeson's next combat report noted improved accuracy, but still felt something was wrong. The engagement ranges where he was actually getting hits didn't match what he expected. Tolliver pulled Beeson's gun camera footage and studied it frame by frame. He noticed that Beeson's most effective bursts occurred when the target was roughly filling 1/4 of the gun sight reticle, which corresponded to a range of approximately 400 yards. At that range, with convergence set at 350 yards, the bullet streams were still slightly separated but beginning to merge. Tolliver had a hypothesis. What if the optimal convergence wasn't where bullets crossed, but slightly before they crossed? What if you wanted bullets converging into a tight pattern as they approached the crossing point, rather than after they had already crossed and started spreading apart? He adjusted Beeson's guns to converge at exactly 400 yards and added one additional modification based on ballistics data he had studied. He adjusted the vertical convergence so bullets from all 6 guns would arrive at the same altitude at 400 yards, compensating for the slight drop that 50 caliber rounds experienced over that distance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next mission proved the theory. Beeson engaged a Messerschmitt 109 at approximately 420 yards range and fired a 4-second burst. The gun camera footage showed a devastating concentration of fire. The 109's tail section separated from the fuselage. Beeson hadn't walked his fire onto the target or made adjustments during the burst. He had simply placed his gun sight reticle on the target and fired. The convergence pattern did everything else. Word spread through the 4th Fighter Group immediately. Within 2 weeks, every aircraft in the group had guns converged at 400 yards. The results were measurable and immediate. In August 1943, the 4th Fighter Group claimed 16 confirmed aerial victories. In September, after the convergence change, they claimed 31. The kill-to-loss ratio improved from roughly 2-to-1 to nearly 5-to-1. Other groups noticed and started asking questions. The 56th Fighter Group under Major Johnson adopted 400-yard convergence in October 1943. The 56th's victory totals jumped from single digits per month to consistent double-digit claims. By December 1943, 8 Fighter Command issued a technical directive recommending 400-yard convergence as standard for all P-47 and P-51 units. But understanding why 400 yards worked required examining the ballistics of 50 caliber ammunition in ways that most fighter pilots never considered. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun fired an armor-piercing incendiary round that weighed roughly 46 grams. When it left the barrel, that round was traveling at approximately 2,800 feet per second. At 400 yards, 1,200 feet distance, the round was still traveling at roughly 2,400 feet per second. It retained approximately 73% of its initial kinetic energy. This energy retention was critical because it determined penetration capability. A 50 caliber round striking an aircraft at 2,400 feet per second could penetrate roughly 3/4 of an inch of aluminum alloy, which was thicker than any skin panel on German fighters. The round would punch through the outer skin, continue through internal structures, and potentially exit the other side after destroying whatever lay in its path. Fuel tanks, hydraulic lines, control cables, ammunition storage, engine components, pilot, everything was vulnerable. But the ballistic trajectory created a timing window that pilots needed to understand. At ranges less than 300 yards, 50 caliber rounds were still flying relatively flat trajectories. Bullet drop was minimal, perhaps 6 inches over that distance. This sounds ideal until you factor in closing speeds and human reaction time. If you opened fire at 250 yards while closing at a combined speed of 500 miles per hour, approximately 730 feet per second, The target would cover 150 feet before you could react to your own tracer rounds and adjust aim. You'd be inside 100 yards within 0.2 of a second. At that range, targets filled your entire windscreen. Accurate fire became almost impossible because you were reacting to visual overload rather than making calculated shots. At ranges beyond 500 yards, 50 caliber ballistics degraded significantly. Bullet drop exceeded 30 inches at 600 yards. Round velocity decreased below 2,000 feet per second, reducing penetration capability. Dispersion patterns widened as bullets encountered more atmospheric drag and destabilized slightly. Effective hit probability dropped below 2% even with perfect aim. 400 yards represented the mathematical sweet spot where multiple factors aligned. Bullets retained enough energy to guarantee penetration. Trajectories remained flat enough that minor aiming errors didn't matter significantly. Closing speeds gave pilots roughly 1 full second to observe their tracer rounds and make corrections if needed. And most importantly, the convergence pattern created what amounted to an 8-second kill zone. Here's how the 8-second calculation worked. Each Browning M2 carried between 267 and 400 rounds depending on aircraft type and configuration. At 800 rounds per minute maximum firing rate, that translated to 13 rounds per second per gun. 6 guns meant 78 rounds per second total, but maximum firing rate was actually burst rate. Sustained firing caused barrel heating and occasional jams. Practical firing rate for 4-second bursts was closer to 600 rounds per minute, or 10 rounds per second per gun. 60 rounds per second total across all 6 guns. At 400 yards, with all 6 guns converging into a 6-foot by 4-foot box, those 60 rounds per second were creating a density of fire that was almost impossible to fly through unscathed. Think of it as a shotgun pattern in 3 dimensions. A single 50 caliber round might miss. 10 rounds arriving in the same second created a pattern where evasion was nearly impossible. The German pilot could see tracer rounds, which were visible every 5th round, but those tracers were showing him where bullets had been, not where they were going. By the time he processed what he was seeing and started evasive maneuvers, the damage was already done. The 8-second number came from ammunition capacity limitations. Most P-51 Mustangs carried roughly 400 rounds per outboard gun and 280 rounds per inboard gun, giving approximately 1,300 rounds per side or 2,600 rounds total. At 60 rounds per second practical firing rate, that ammunition load would last roughly 43 seconds of continuous firing. But continuous firing was never used. Standard doctrine called for burst firing, typically 2 to 4 seconds per burst. A 4-second burst consumed roughly 240 rounds total, leaving enough ammunition for approximately 10 full bursts before running dry. However, combat engagements rarely involved 10 separate attacks. Most fighter versus fighter engagements were resolved in 1 to 3 bursts. If you needed more than that, either you were missing consistently or the target was extraordinarily resilient. The 8-second reference actually meant something more specific. It was the total effective firing time during a typical engagement where the target remained within the 400-yard kill zone. Here's how that played out in practice. American fighter pilots approaching a German aircraft from an advantageous position, typically from above and behind, or from the side with an altitude advantage, would begin their attack run at approximately 800 to 1,000 yards. At that range, the German pilot might not yet see the threat. American doctrine emphasized using sun position and cloud cover to mask approaches. The attacking pilot would establish his angle, check his airspeed to ensure he wasn't closing too fast, and begin a controlled descent or turn toward the intercept point. At 600 yards, experienced German pilots usually detected the threat. Lookout doctrine in the Luftwaffe emphasized constant scanning, and most German fighter pilots surviving into late 1943 had developed exceptional situational awareness. They would begin evasive maneuvers, typically a hard brake turn or a split-S dive, depending on their altitude and energy state. This gave them perhaps 2 seconds before the American pilot reached firing range. At 500 yards, the American pilot would be tracking the target through his gun sight, making final corrections for deflection angle if the target was turning. His hand would move to the trigger, but doctrine still said wait. 500 yards was outside the optimal convergence zone. Firing now meant spreading bullets too widely and wasting ammunition. Patience was survival. At 450 yards, the German pilot's evasive maneuvers would be fully developed. He might be pulling 4 or 5 Gs in a hard turn, compressing himself down into his seat while trying to keep the American fighter in visual contact over his shoulder. His aircraft would be at maximum performance, engines screaming, airframe stressed to its limits. This was exactly the moment American pilots had learned to exploit. At 400 yards, the trigger squeeze initiated the 8-second engagement window. The first rounds would take approximately half a second to reach the target. During that half second, the German aircraft would move perhaps 60 feet along its flight path. But the American pilot wasn't aiming at where the German aircraft was. He was using deflection shooting principles, aiming at where the target would be when bullets arrived. This required the same counterintuitive thinking that bomber gunners had learned, firing at empty air and trusting physics. The convergence pattern at 400 yards meant that all 6 gun streams were merging into that 6-foot by 4-foot box precisely where the German aircraft was flying. For the next 3 to 4 seconds, as the range closed from 400 yards to 300 yards, every round fired passed through or very near the target aircraft. The German pilot might attempt to jink, throwing his aircraft into rapid direction changes, but at closing speeds often exceeding 600 feet per second, there wasn't enough time or space to maneuver out of the pattern. At 300 yards, roughly 3 seconds into the burst, the American pilot would release the trigger. The range was closing too fast. Inside 300 yards, convergence patterns began spreading apart again as bullets crossed their convergence point and continued outward on diverging paths. More critically, at 300 yards or less, collision became a serious risk. Several American pilots in 1943 had actually collided with German aircraft they were shooting at, either because they couldn't pull out in time or because debris from the disintegrating target struck their aircraft. The total engagement time from trigger squeeze to release was typically 3 to 4 seconds. The 8-second window referred to the maximum effective firing time available if the pilot chose to use it, but combat discipline demanded shorter bursts. 4 seconds of firing consumed roughly 240 rounds. That was enough to put 40 rounds into a 6-foot by 4-foot space at 400 yards if aim was perfect. In reality, with deflection errors and minor aiming mistakes, perhaps 20 to 30 rounds would actually strike the target. 20-50 caliber rounds arriving within 4 seconds was absolutely devastating. Combat reports from late 1943 through 1945 documented what concentrated 50 caliber fire actually did to German aircraft. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 36th Fighter Group filed a particularly detailed after-action report following an engagement on October 10, 1944, during which he shot down a Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, one of Germany's most advanced aircraft. Drew had fired a 4-second burst at 420 yards while the jet was in a shallow climb. His gun camera footage, later analyzed frame by frame, showed the progression of damage. The initial rounds struck the 262's right engine nacelle. 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through the thin aluminum cowling and into the Jumo 004 turbojet engine spinning at 8,700 RPM. The turbine blades, designed for high-temperature operation but not ballistic impact, shattered. Fragments traveled through the engine at supersonic speeds, shredding the combustion chamber and fuel lines. The engine didn't just stop, it exploded internally, sending shrapnel through the surrounding airframe. Subsequent rounds walked across the fuselage. Gun camera footage showed bright flashes as incendiary compounds ignited fuel vapors. The 262 carried nearly 600 gallons of jet fuel in fuselage tanks. Multiple 50 caliber hits ruptured those tanks. Fuel sprayed into the slipstream and ignited from the burning engine. Within 2 seconds of the initial impact, the entire right side of the aircraft was engulfed in flames. The pilot ejected 3 seconds later. Total time from first round impact to aircraft destruction was less than 7 seconds. This level of destructive capability was consistent across all German fighter types once American pilots learned to deliver concentrated fire at optimal range. The FW-190, despite being one of the most rugged fighters Germany produced, couldn't withstand sustained 50 caliber fire at Convergence range. Its radial engine, massive and powerful, presented a large target. 50 caliber rounds punching through cylinder heads or crankcase would disable the engine almost immediately. With engine power gone, the 190 became a glider with poor aerodynamic characteristics. Most pilots bailed out rather than attempting forced landings. The Messerschmitt 109 had different vulnerabilities. Its inverted V12 engine was more compact than the 190's radial, presenting a smaller target, but the cooling system was fragile. The 109 used liquid cooling with external radiators mounted under the wings and fuselage. A single 50 caliber hit on a radiator would drain coolant within 30 seconds. Without coolant, the Daimler-Benz engine would cease from overheating within 2 minutes. 109 pilots caught far from friendly territory, with damaged cooling systems faced impossible choices: bail out over enemy territory or attempt to nurse a dying engine home and likely crash anyway. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tactical implications of 400-yard convergence extended beyond simple gunnery. Once American fighter groups adopted this standard, their entire combat doctrine evolved around exploiting the 8-second engagement window. Fighter tactics became exercises in geometry and energy management, designed to deliver aircraft into that precise 400-yard kill zone while denying German pilots the same opportunity. The Finger 4 formation, adopted from German Luftwaffe tactics and refined by American fighter groups in late 1943, was specifically designed to create 400-yard firing opportunities. 4 aircraft flew in a wide formation resembling 4 fingertips of an outstretched hand. Each aircraft was separated by approximately 1,500 feet laterally and staggered in altitude by 500 feet. This spacing meant that if one aircraft was engaged by an enemy fighter, his wingman could approach the attacker from an angle that naturally led to a 400-yard shot. Major Don Blakesley, commanding officer of the 4th Fighter Group, refined these tactics throughout 1944. His doctrine emphasized patience and positioning over aggressive pursuit. Blakesley taught his pilots to avoid chasing German fighters that were extending away at high speed. Instead, he emphasized maintaining altitude and position, forcing German pilots to either commit to their attack runs on bombers or disengage entirely. When German fighters did commit, they became predictable. An Me-109 diving toward a bomber formation would be in a shallow dive at known speed, making a simple ballistic trajectory. American fighters above and behind could roll into pursuit angles that naturally culminated at 400 yards as the German pilot pulled out of his attack. The mathematics of pursuit curves and intercept angles became standardized. Fighter pilots learned that a 30-degree deflection angle, approaching from the target's 4 o'clock or 8 o'clock position, provided the optimal combination of closure rate and aiming solution. At 30 degrees, the target appeared to move slowly across the gunsight reticle, making deflection shooting manageable. The closure rate was fast enough to reach firing range quickly, but slow enough to allow precise aiming. And most importantly, 30-degree attacks naturally positioned the attacking aircraft to reach 400 yards while the target was still in the kill zone. Technical Sergeant James Johnson, an armourer with the 352nd Fighter Group, kept detailed maintenance logs of gun system performance throughout 1944. His records revealed patterns that validated the 400-yard doctrine. Aircraft returning from missions where pilots reported kills at ranges between 350 and 450 yards consistently showed ammunition expenditure between 180 and 300 rounds. Aircraft where pilots reported engaging at closer ranges often expended over 500 rounds per kill. The efficiency difference was striking. Pilots who maintained range discipline were achieving kills with less than half the ammunition expenditure of pilots who closed too tightly. The German Luftwaffe recognized what was happening and attempted to adapt, but their solutions were constrained by industrial and tactical realities. Luftwaffe fighter tactics in 1945 emphasized boom and zoom attacks, diving through bomber formations at maximum speed, firing a brief burst, and extending away before American escorts could react. This doctrine minimized exposure time, which improved German pilot survival rates, but it also reduced bombing accuracy and kill effectiveness against bombers. German pilots complained in interrogation reports that American fighter tactics had become frustratingly defensive. The Americans wouldn't chase, they wouldn't be drawn into turning fights, they simply stayed above and behind the bombers, waiting for German fighters to commit. Once committed, German pilots found themselves under attack from multiple angles, and the American 50-caliber fire seemed impossibly accurate at ranges where German 20mm cannons were barely effective. The range differential was significant. German MG 151 20mm cannons had maximum effective range of approximately 300 yards. Beyond that, the relatively slow muzzle velocity of roughly 2,500 feet per second and significant bullet drop made aiming extremely difficult. German pilots trained to close within 200 yards before opening fire, which put them well inside the American 400-yard kill zone. By the time a German pilot reached his own optimal firing range, he had already spent 2 to 3 seconds under accurate American fire. Several Luftwaffe tactical manuals captured in late 1944 specifically warned pilots about American firing ranges. A training document dated November 1944 from Jagdgeschwader 11 stated, "American fighters, particularly the Mustang, will engage at ranges exceeding 400 meters. Do not assume you are safe until you have broken visual contact. Their tracer fire is often first indication of engagement." The document recommended extreme evasive maneuvers as soon as any American fighter was sighted, rather than waiting for hostile action. This represented a complete reversal from early war German doctrine, which had taught pilots to press attacks aggressively. The industrial production aspects of American 50-caliber dominance were equally important. By 1944, American industry was producing 50-caliber ammunition at rates that defied comprehension. Monthly production exceeded 40 million rounds by mid-1944. This meant that American fighter pilots could afford to fire longer bursts without worrying about ammunition conservation. German pilots, conversely, faced chronic ammunition shortages. A typical Me-109 in 1945 might carry only 120 rounds per cannon, enough for approximately 6 seconds of firing time. German pilots learned to fire in half-second bursts to conserve ammunition, which further reduced their hit probability. The P-51 Mustang, which became the dominant American escort fighter in 1944, was specifically designed around the 6-gun, 400-yard Convergence concept. North American aviation engineers positioned the guns in the wings with mounting angles that naturally converged at 400 yards without requiring extensive field adjustments. The ammunition bays were designed to feed smoothly at high G-loads, reducing jamming incidents that had plagued earlier fighters. And perhaps most importantly, the Mustang's aerodynamic stability made it an excellent gun platform. Pilots could fire sustained bursts without significant vibration or recoil effects, throwing off their aim. Captain Clarence "Bud" Anderson, who flew 116 combat missions with the 357th Fighter Group and was credited with 16 confirmed victories, described the Mustang's gunnery characteristics in post-war interviews. He emphasized that the aircraft's stability allowed pilots to use very fine aiming corrections. A tiny stick movement would shift the bullet stream by feet at 400 yards, allowing precise placement even during high-speed maneuvering. Anderson stated that once he learned to trust the convergence pattern, shooting became almost instinctive. He would place the target in his sight, lead appropriately for deflection, and squeeze the trigger, knowing that the guns would put bullets exactly where the sight was pointing. The training pipeline evolved to emphasize 400-yard gunnery. By mid-1944, fighter pilot training in the United States included extensive exercises focused specifically on achieving hits at that range. Gunnery ranges used full-scale target drones that simulated German fighter dimensions. Students were required to achieve minimum 30% hit rates at 400 yards in controlled conditions before graduating to operational training. The washout rate for students who couldn't master 400-yard shooting was approximately 15%, indicating how seriously the Army Air Forces took this skill. Advanced training incorporated combat film study. Student pilots watched hours of gun camera footage from successful engagements, analyzing how experienced pilots positioned for 400-yard shots. They studied closure rates, deflection angles, and burst timing. The instruction was repetitive and demanding, but effective. Pilots arriving at operational units in late 1944 were far better prepared for convergence zone fighting than their counterparts from early 1943. The psychological aspect of 400-yard combat was significant, but rarely discussed in official documents. Pilots had to overcome powerful instincts that urged them to close with targets. Human nature wants to get close to ensure hits. Evolution programmed humans to fight at arm's length where success is visually confirmable. But 400 yards is nearly a quarter mile. At that range, targets appear small in the gun sight. The natural reaction is that you're too far away, that bullets will never connect across that distance. Successful fighter pilots learned to suppress that instinct and trust the ballistics. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, top American ace in Europe with 28 confirmed victories, addressed this mental challenge directly when training new pilots in his fighter group. He would tell them that shooting at 400 yards felt wrong specifically because it was the correct range. Your brain, he explained, would tell you to close to 200 yards where the target looked larger and more vulnerable. But at 200 yards you were inside the enemy's effective cannon range, your own convergence pattern had spread apart, and your closure rate often meant you would overshoot before getting sufficient rounds on target. 400 yards felt uncomfortable because it required trusting mathematics over instinct. Gabreski insisted that comfort was the enemy of effectiveness. The statistical evidence bore out these principles overwhelmingly. Analysis of aerial combat results from January 1944 through April 1945 showed that American fighters achieved an overall kill-to-loss ratio of approximately 5-1 against German fighters. This ratio varied by aircraft type and tactical situation, but the aggregate numbers were definitive. For every American fighter lost in air-to-air combat, 5 German fighters were destroyed. This was unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare and represented a complete reversal from early war ratios. More detailed analysis broke down these victories by engagement range when such data was available from gun camera footage. Engagements initiated between 350 and 450 yards showed kill rates approximately 3 times higher than engagements initiated at other ranges. The conclusion was unavoidable. 400-yard convergence, combined with disciplined firing techniques, was the primary factor enabling American air superiority over Europe. The lessons from World War II 400-yard gunnery didn't end in 1945. They influenced jet fighter design throughout the Cold War and continue to inform weapons system development today. Early jet fighters like the F-80 Shooting Star and F-86 Sabre retained 50-caliber machine guns specifically because of their proven effectiveness. The Sabre's 6 50-caliber guns were converged at 1,000 feet, approximately 330 yards, reflecting updated ballistics calculations for jet combat speeds, but retaining the fundamental principle of creating a concentrated kill zone. The transition to air-to-air missiles in the 1950s seemed to make gun convergence obsolete. Why calculate bullet trajectories when you could fire a heat-seeking Sidewinder missile that would track targets automatically? The answer came over Vietnam, where American fighter pilots discovered that missiles were not the complete solution. Early Sidewinders had reliability problems and minimum range limitations. In close combat, guns remained essential. The F-4 Phantom was initially designed without an internal gun, relying entirely on missiles. Combat experience forced the addition of external gun pods, and later variants incorporated internal cannons. Modern fighters like the F-15 Eagle and F-16 Fighting Falcon carry 20mm Gatling guns capable of firing 6,000 rounds per minute. These weapons systems use computerized fire control that automatically calculates convergence based on target range, but the underlying principle remains identical to what Master Sergeant Tolliver discovered in 1943. Concentrated fire, delivered at optimal range, maximizes kill probability. The computer simply performs the calculations that World War II pilots had to learn through experience and intuition. The most direct descendant of 400-yard convergence doctrine is the modern concept of weapons employment zone. Current fighter tactics define specific ranges where different weapons achieve maximum effectiveness. The WWII for cannon fire against maneuvering targets in an F-16 is approximately 1,500 to 3,000 feet, roughly comparable to the 300 to 600 yards that World War II pilots used. Outside that zone, hit probability drops too low. Inside that zone, closure rates create collision risks. The zone represents the 8-second window, where physics and geometry align to create an inescapable kill box. Even beyond military applications, the principle of convergence zones appears throughout technology and sports. Photographers understand depth of field, the zone where focus is sharpest. Athletes recognize the sweet spot where bat meets ball or racket meets tennis ball for maximum power transfer. Surgeons know the optimal distance for specific procedures where hand-eye coordination and tool precision align. These are all manifestations of the same concept. There exists a specific range where multiple factors converge to create optimal effectiveness. The young American fighter pilots who learned to suppress their instincts and fire at targets a quarter-mile away were demonstrating humanity's capacity to adapt intuition to technological demands. They couldn't rely on evolutionary programming. No ancestor had ever needed to calculate deflection angles and convergence zones while traveling at 300 miles per hour and being shot at. They had to learn entirely new skills, trust completely counterintuitive methods, and apply those methods under conditions of extreme stress and mortal danger. The cost of learning these lessons was measured in thousands of lives. Early 1943 saw American fighter groups suffering losses they could barely sustain while achieving limited results. Bomber crews watched German fighters attack repeatedly because American escorts couldn't shoot them down effectively. The frustration was overwhelming, made worse by the knowledge that American aircraft were arguably superior to German fighters in most performance categories. The P-47 Thunderbolt could outdive anything Germany had. The P-51 Mustang had better range and high-altitude performance than the Mi-109, but performance advantages meant nothing if pilots couldn't hit their targets. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.